Hi, I'm Terry and your host for this next provocation session. This part of our challenge to create proposals to build back better is to get different perspectives to inspire and provoke fresh thinking. Our speaker now will do that and more, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. She is on her way. That's here we go, lovely. And here she is. I was just said your name and I meant to check that, but Jessica is a political economist from America, an ambassador for the cooperative movement, and currently professor of community justice and social economic development at the City University of New York. So delighted to welcome you here, Jessica, and your topic, which is in the wake of the recent Black Lives Matter movement, how economic democracy and justice are very important to include in the debate, just as much as better social and political rights. So that is my bit for introducing you, done, and I will be back to coordinate the Q&As. So over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I do want to bring in our ancestors to this space. To bring them in, I want to recognize the struggles of all those who combat racism, police brutality, and state violence. Remember the fallen. Acknowledge the movement for Black lives. And just to say I stand on the shoulders of people who've used solidarity and cooperation for survival and to thrive. So I want to talk about this issue of why economic justice, economic democracy, and economic justice are so important to the racial justice movement. And why do I talk about that? Because in the African American community in the US, we've always been active and protested and resisted enslavement, dehumanization, right? We've exercised our rights in a million different ways for civil rights, human rights, political rights, social rights. We've also been active in trying to gain economic rights, especially some economic independence, some economic equality and justice, but those movements haven't been as pronounced. We don't talk about them as much. We haven't been involved in thinking about that connection between economic rights and political rights for African Americans. And I think that this, the lessons I've been learning from studying African American mutual aid, cooperativism, and solidarity economics, I think the lessons we've learned are lessons for any group, especially any subaltern group around the world. And so I wanted us to talk a little bit about that today. And Henry wanted me to be a little provocative, so hopefully I am. And so when we look at what African Americans have tried to do, we really haven't been able to get true human rights, true justice without the economic justice piece. And so why do I say that? I've got about 5 reasons to show you for why social and political rights aren't enough if we're really talking about liberation, freedom, non-oppression, getting rid of racism, that kind of thing. The first thing is just the simple economic retaliation. When we have protested, we've been retaliated against economically, lost our jobs. The best examples are when we were sharecroppers, meaning we were renting land, farming land that we rented from other people. In most cases, it would be in the southern US, Black people renting from whites who kept them in debt peonage. So every year you owe more and more to the landowner, and you barely have any control over the crops that you grow. You're always having to borrow, and you're always owing the landowner. So when sharecroppers started getting involved in the civil rights activities, they actually were thrown off the land or given even worse prices for their harvest, that kind of thing. People who registered to vote were jailed and beaten and lost their jobs. Protesters have been jailed and beaten and can lose their jobs. And so someone famous in the Black history, Fannie Lou Hamer from the 1960s and 70s, she was a very strong member of SNCC in Mississippi, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was best known for her voting rights activities. She actually was beaten very horribly, lost a kidney, and had health problems for the rest of her life because of how she was beaten, just because she was registering to vote and teaching other people to register to vote. She finally said, after about 3 or 4 years of this, that, again, the same thing I'm saying, that they can retaliate against us if we don't control our own economic system. We need to own our own land, grow our own food, have affordable housing. And so she started a project called Freedom Farm. And that's exactly what she did. They bought land. They were able to raise money to buy land, to farm it collectively. They put affordable housing on it, worker co-ops for childcare and other projects. And she said, we first need that economic protection. We need to be able to feed ourselves and live somewhere that's not dependent on the outside, on the dominant group. And then once we have that, then maybe we can have a better platform for fighting for our voting rights. A similar example, not quite as articulate, is Freedom Quilting Bee in Alabama in the late 60s. They were actually a sewing cooperative started by sharecropping women. They wanted to sell their quilts for extra income. I hope we're okay because my electricity, we're in the middle of a storm here, but let me keep going. We built a sewing plant. They built a sewing plant. So that they started sewing not from home, but from their own factory. They then needed childcare and other after-school programs. They were able to buy 23 acres of land as a co-op. They were then able to use that land, not just for their own sewing factory, but also to give other sharecroppers, including their own families, a place to farm without being in debt peonage. They also sold a couple of their lots to ex-sharecroppers, again, to help people because people were getting evicted from registering to vote, that kind of thing. By 1992, they were the largest employer in their town, and so a very successful women's co-op that was fighting against both the economic debt peonage, but also giving people that platform, that economic independence. The second issue is even when we can vote, we often can't feed our families. We have no place to live because racism isn't just a political system. It's an economic system. There's lots of apartheid economic systems and economic inequality that comes with racism. So even gaining a political right like voting doesn't always help. The late and great John Lewis, who just died last week, also a member, actually, who was one of the early presidents of SNCC. He was operated actually in Alabama and then Georgia and became a congressman from Georgia for about 30 years. In his autobiography, when he talks about his first jobs in rural Alabama, he also says the same thing. He said, we had finally gotten some voting rights. Some people were able to vote. We had a little bit of political power, but we were still poor. We were still starving. We couldn't feed our children. We didn't have adequate housing. And so co-ops were the solution to that. He was working with groups that were going around helping people to start credit unions and co-op businesses, co-op farming, because they realized that it wasn't good enough just to have the political rights. To keep them and to stay alive, they needed to work cooperatively. They needed that control over their economics. My third reason for why I say this is that you also have subgroups in the race, among Black Americans, as we said, who can get rich and leave the community, but it doesn't help the rest of the community prosper. So this is where the economic democracy, even more than economic justice, comes into play. If you if certain people just get rich and move out of the community and don't give back, don't help their neighbors or whatever, then allowing some people to sort of make it economically doesn't help the whole community. But cooperative solidarity economics does, right? It helps to recirculate resources locally. It helps to make sure that everybody benefits. That's something Fannie Lou Hamer talked about also, that if you ownership, you develop the whole community, not individuals. W.E.B. Du Bois said this in 1907. He talked about that we were at the crossroads of whether we should just allow a few individuals to kind of make it and be happy with that, or whether we needed a strategy like cooperative economics that would bring more of the whole group, more of the whole community into prosperity. And so that, again, that issue that if you don't have real economic, even with some economic justice or a little bit of economic equality, you don't get full liberation for a group of people. And then, of course, in U.S. society, economics rules politics. So that would be my third reason why we have to pay attention to economic justice and economic democracy. Politics, who can run for office, who can afford to run for office, right, is based on who has the money to back the political officials. And so then when they get elected, they're beholden to the people who put the money, who back them. And so again, if you don't want political policies and political decisions and state apparatus to be in control of the rich, then we've got to have an economic democracy, right? We've got to have a more, vertical, flat economic system where everybody has enough, where we're not buying positions and buying influence and buying control. And then finally, my fifth, actually, I guess I have six. My fifth one is that poverty and economic injustice actually divert our attention and our energy. We spend so much time trying to feed ourselves and our families, trying to find decent lodging, that we don't have much energy to be active to fight against oppression, to fight against inequality and injustice. And so, again, if we don't have some economic democracy and economic prosperity, even though we do it, and every era has shown that people still fight and still resist, but it makes it much harder to fight and resist if you don't have some economic control over your lives. And then finally, my sixth one is that since we spend so much of our waking hours at work, if our work is exploitative, oppressive, and hierarchical, then we don't actually practice democracy daily. We're supposed to kind of practice it when we vote, right, and in politics. But if we're not practicing it every day in our daily lives and the way we live, then we don't even really know how to be democratic, how to make decisions with a group of people, how to solve conflict, that kind of thing. And so we just allow sort of representative democracy to go on the way it is. And so we can't really, again, achieve that political democracy, social justice, if we don't practice economic democracy. That's where we live and breathe democracy the most. So I'm winding up now. Maybe it is less than 20-minute talk. But anyway, I have a couple more examples to connect sort of what's happening today with this notion about how important economic democracy and economic justice is. And so I want to look at the Black Lives Matter movement and its precursor, the Black Panther Party. And what happened in both of those cases, where we had groups of young Black people who were saying enough is enough in terms of police brutality and state violence, but how did they address it? They didn't just, the Black Panthers are known for self-defense and toting guns and that kind of thing. But if you actually look closely at their programs and their legacy, most of what they did was community development programs, and they did it mostly with solidarity economics and collectives. And so what they said was, yes, we need to defend ourselves and stop the physical violence, but there's also state violence, which is not so physical, and we need to defend ourselves from that too. And the way to protect ourselves from state violence is through cooperative economics, collectivism, solidarity, right? They had shoe factories where they gave away free shoes, they had free clothing distributions, they gave free breakfast to children and then taught them Black history while they were eating. They had free health clinics and got doctors to donate their time to taking care of health care. They had transportation, pest control. They had a collective newsletter. They did collective cooperative housing. And so they said, we really can't, it's not enough to say self-defense and think about it in terms of violence, right? We have to have self-defense in terms of controlling our economics. And then, 20, 30 years later, we look at the movement for Black Lives, actually their platform from 2016. So it didn't even start in 2020. But as part of their fight against police brutality in the prison industrial complex, they include economic justice as a huge part of their platform. They want to reconstruct an economy to ensure Black communities have collective ownership, not merely access, a right to restored land, clean air, clean water, clean housing, health care. They want to support, they say in here, support the development of cooperatives and social economy networks and demand financial support. So again, even the movements that are very specifically on the ground trying to stop Black bodies from being harmed physically are also talking about this need for economic justice, economic independence, economic self-determination. So I think I'll stop there. If you want me to give you some other examples, I can. I think the biggest thing is for us to think about to make real change in society and to really address oppression, racism, injustice. We really have to look at the connections with economics and how important economic democracy, economic justice, economic local control is, really to any group, but I have focused on African Americans. Thank you.
That was brilliant and so topical, so pertinent. Thank you very much. Yeah. And I think it's time, yes, to open it up to the wider team and the group to ask questions. But I have one straight away, which is the fact that I live in Bristol and we had the statue of Edward Colston torn down as part of a Black Lives Matter protest. And just all of that activity and the focus, I wanted to ask, do you think that there is much more opportunity to make change happen now?
I think, yeah, I've been pleasantly surprised. I'm not that young anymore, so I feel like I've seen a few of these movements come and go. I feel like my father now talking about, oh, I've seen this and I've seen that. But I have, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And so, they always seemed hopeful because we both had people that were active and people that had strategy, right? Plans for what we needed to do. But this time, I think because everybody is just so fed up between the COVID issues and healthcare issues, right? And then on top of that, we still have to deal with police brutality, and right, and that reminds us of all the economic all the inequalities, whether they're economic or not. I think people are really fed up this time. The thing that seems newest to me is how much more solidarity we have from allies outside of the Black community, and that's what gives me hope to think that this time things might really change for the better. I'm not sure that enough people are still talking about the economic changes, but I do feel like at least we now have a broader, wider political set of political allies. I mean, I tears came to my eyes when I saw pictures of like white allies putting themselves between Blacks and the police, things like that. That I don't remember seeing as much of that. I mean, we always had a little bit, but it seems like that's so much more. So that makes it hopeful. But I do think that we can't really win this until we add the economic dimensions.
Yeah. That's cool. So we have a couple of questions coming up, and one of them is, do you think hierarchical relationships in the workplace work against economic democracy? Should businesses replace vertical power structures?
Yes, I did. I think I hinted at that. I'll say it even more strongly now. Absolutely. As I said, the first thing is, if you think about it, we spend more time at work than any other thing we do. Maybe we sleep longer, but some of us don't even sleep as much as we work, right? So we're spending all our time. That means, one, if our work is that hierarchical and that oppressive, we're accepting it, right? Because we're accepting it because we want the money that we make from working in that situation, right? And we're so used to people either telling us what to do or being rude or mean to us, not listening to our advice, not letting us weigh in on stuff. So then why would we do it when we get home or in a political activity, right? I mean, we're already kind of beaten down. We're used to just waiting for people to tell us what to do and accepting it or whatever. So to expect us to operate the other 5 hours that we're awake or whatever, to operate in a way that's democratic and collective and solidaristic. I mean, we do it in some ways just because we're human beings, right? So we are kind of solidaristic with our families. We try to be with our friends sometimes, but to really do it and to be active politically and civically, it's hard. And it's hard to get out of those ways. Even when we're trying to be democratic, it's hard to get out of those ways because we're so used to work. So I think if we really want to make a change, I think it's two things. One, in our education systems, right, from kindergarten, or I don't know what you call preschool or whatever, your first years of formal education, I think we need to start teaching and training young people about how to reclaim that human value and human trait of cooperation, right? We kind of beat it out of them when we send them to public school. But if we change that around and actually embraced it and help them to learn how to be cooperators even more and how to use it and how to, address conflict and come to joint decisions and that kind of stuff. So in school. And then the second thing we need to do is we need to make sure we start doing that in our workplaces. And the other thing that's so interesting about the economics of work is that if you study workplace democracy, most of the successful 21st century businesses actually practice some level of it. They don't go all the way to ownership. They don't go all the way to totally vertical, right? But most of them are successful because they allow those quality circles, some labor management agreements and things like that, because they actually realize they're more productive when they have a better democratic relationship. And so if we could actually change it over, we'd be more productive, but also as human beings, we would be better, and then we would know how to do democracy in politics and our social lives.
Really is about getting all the balances right. So we have Tom, who's asking a question that we have a voting system with the Q&A, so some questions come right to the top. And he's asking, and I might just get Tom up in a minute, but I'll ask his question first, so you can have a think about it. Is how do you believe you and your community can seize power and control if those who are in power and have the wealth don't want to give it to you? Is solidarity enough? So Tom, are you happy? I'm going to try and get you up as well to get your, and here we go. Hello, Tom.
Oh, pleased to join you, and thank you for the inspiring talk. It's very, very, just get this message across. I don't want to deflate the optimism and solidarity of people who are struggling for economic justice across the world. Don't want to do that, but it's going to be a hard struggle. People aren't going to say, okay, yes, we'll give it to you. So what do you do next? Businesses and the corporations who have got huge power, wealth, and influence say no. Or say, okay, maybe, but not yet. How do you really effectively challenge that? And is solidarity enough to do that? I think it needs a little bit more.
It's a great question, and don't worry, you're not the first one to ask it. I get that question a lot because, even my students ask me that question all the time. They think I'm, and my children for a while thought I was just Miss Pollyanna, but they actually have come around. So yeah, it's a great question. And so I'll answer it in two ways. Just to agree with you, it's a problem because I actually have written about what I call the sabotage against Black co-ops and actually other co-ops too, right? White supremacists, white competitors in general have tried in all different ways to sabotage the co-ops through history. I have actually a piece out in the Journal of African American History on sabotage of co-ops and why we need reparations to pay back for that sabotage, because Black co-ops were, the banks wouldn't give them money, loans or lines of credit. Insurance companies would jack up the insurance if you were a co-op. The railroads wouldn't transport your stuff. And then we even had white vigilantes who would lynch and murder Black cooperators and burn down their co-op. So we know that they're not safe. Just because you have a co-op, it's not safe. But what I also learned from that history is two or three things. First of all, people kept trying. They didn't give up just because their co-op was burned down or one of their members were lynched. Sometimes they had to go underground and do things quietly. Often they had co-ops but didn't call them co-ops, so they wouldn't be targeted, right? So they did a lot of sort of stuff, sub rosa, sort of underground kind of activity. But they also some of the co-ops that were able to even survive those sabotages survived because the whole rest of the community supported the co-op. And so I often talk about how having community support, making sure the community knows what you're doing, that, why you're a co-op, who, that you're owned by other community members. They help by being customers, to give you a customer base. They often help by physically, again, surrounding the co-op and stopping the saboteurs, that kind of stuff. So community, making sure you have good communications and connections. That's where, again, another side of solidarity comes in. Solidarity with your entire community seems to matter. And having connections with organizations. I also found that in Black history, the 3 periods in Black history that had the most Black co-ops were also the 3 periods that had some of the strongest Black organizations talking about co-op economics, or helping people to do cooperative education or co-op development, or raising money for co-op development, even though some of the organizations did it very quietly again. But the periods, right, there's a coincide with periods that were strong Black organizations. So again, that's part of the solidarity, right? And then the final thing is, I do have a kind of optimistic view that if we stay under the radar for as long as possible with very small local activity, that seems to be so far, right? Most people, if you don't seem threatening, if you seem too small to be threatening, they allow you to happen because they don't think anything more will happen. But if we had a lot of small, successful co-ops that then interlinked and worked in their communities to kind of gain control of their elected officials, get more support, like that, I believe we could it's sort of like that notion of the snow, right? Comes softly, but makes a blizzard or whatever. So I sort of have that notion that if we can come softly, get a good bearing in our communities and grow up from the bottom, that we have a chance, especially with that solidarity among the people who aren't originally in the co-ops. And then, right, the credit unions and the worker co-ops and the consumer co-ops all need to start working together and supporting each other, so that if you do have economic retaliation, you can still get your supplies from another co-op. I feel like we need all those kind of interlinkages. And then, the last thing for now, for the 21st century, we have a little bit of leeway right now as everybody feels guilty. So they may allow a little bit more of this kind of activity at the moment because they feel guilty. And then hopefully we're strong enough by the time they decide they don't want it anymore that they can't just eliminate us. But it is a problem. I don't have all the answers, but I do hope that some of that perspective I have helps us to think about how we can keep persisting and keep going. And then, last thing, I can't, there's an opportunity here to also talk about failure or lack of failure. I also don't call any of the co-ops, even the ones that have been sabotaged and destroyed, as failures, because the whole process of solidarity and cooperation teaches people skills, leadership, capacity that they then use in other places in other ways, sometimes for a new co-op, sometimes for another activity, sometimes in politics. And so again, even if we try and fail, we haven't really failed because we're stronger for the next fight and we can move on and do more things. So to me, it's worth even the try, even if we're not allowed to prosper through it. The trying is really important because it strengthens us as human beings, and then we are able to do new and more things as we keep moving.
Loving the optimism.
Sorry for the long answer, but I couldn't resist all the pieces.
Tom, are you happy with that answer? Yeah, good, thanks. If you could just turn off your camera now, that'd be great. And we'll move on to another question. As I say, you've got to keep that positive outlook, otherwise change will never happen. So we have Edna asking about, can co-ops thrive without government regulations, especially when government seems to constrain development of citizen solidarity? Can we get Edna up? Would you like to come up, Edna? Just put your mic and camera on. Give her a few minutes, because as you said, there are technical issues as ever. You've got a storm, you were saying.
Yes, we're in the middle of a hurricane.
Yeah, let me get
the edge of a hurricane.
Yeah, let me get.
So for a minute, I thought I was going to lose connection.
Let me get to a place where there is some light.
Yes, that would be good. I
Okay.
think we're getting some from what Jessica's saying, but some physical light as well would be good. But there's a lot of need to keep that.
Sorry for that.
That's all right.
There's some light. I moved to
Okay. Well, while Edna's getting that sorted, there is
Is
this
that
whole thing
better?
about
My
yes.
bulb is a bit low
Well,
on
it's
the other side. Yeah. Oh,
go
okay.
on.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and for that presentation. And I'm from Kenya, and that's why I asked that question, because when I was younger, I saw a lot of cooperatives, especially with farmers, and to market their products, and a lot of them were thriving. But at some point, there was no government funding for co-ops, and then with time, with free markets, now it becomes a competition between like bigger companies and small producers, and it becomes obvious that citizen solidarity is being fought, not overtly, but you can see, you can actually see that it's being fought. But again, when I look at it, and like what you've said, it's important that again we start, having such kind of organizations, citizen solidarity, co-ops. Is it for marketing, for business, and all that? So that's why I asked about that. How really can we borrow from other places where it's functioning without government support, and with a lot of fighting from, market forces, government forces, and such. Yeah, thank you.
Right. So, yeah, we're actually kind of trying to address that in the US too. And so let me first say why government support is important, but then how I've seen us prosper even without it. So we are trying in the US. We don't even have federal co-op and corporation laws. It's all state by state. We don't have federal money to co-ops, though we're starting to get some version of that. And we're starting to get more municipal. Our cities are starting to be convinced about putting money into co-ops. And that's taken a lot of, lobbying and that kind of thing to get that. And we are saying that we would be able to have a stronger co-op community in the US if we had uniform co-op laws, if it didn't matter which state you were in, how you incorporated that kind of thing. So I do think it is important. We need some startup money, especially for people, low-income people who want to do co-ops. They don't always have the money from themselves, even though pulling together helps a lot. Do you mind muting yourself? Thanks. Having government supports in terms of the right kinds of enabling laws are really important. Having some government finance, because after all, it is our money, right? We pay taxes and whatever. Having it funneled back. That was one of my arguments in my article about reparations. I want reparations money to go into co-op education and co-op loan funds, non-extractive co-op loan funds from a federal level and at state and local levels, so that we have enough money to do the education properly and to get the startups, and so that that's not an issue. However, when you have governments that are either fighting or going to be too prescriptive or too limiting, we do have to figure out, right, how to do cooperation and co-ops without that. And so a lot of the examples, I would say probably 80% of the examples I found throughout US history for African Americans did not have federal or state or municipal support for their co-ops. And so what did they do? And here's where it's really fascinating. A lot of the early co-ops and mutual aid were connected to religious institutions and fraternal organizations. And so part of the dues or the tithing that those organizations did would go to the co-op, in addition to people, right, pooling their meager resources. Often they did all kinds of crazy fundraising things. Having a rent party, what we used to call, what were called rent parties, where you raise money for the rent. Well, these would be co-op parties, right? You'd have a party and everyone would have to pay to come to the party, and you use that money to put into the co-op pool. Getting your friends and relatives, even if they weren't members of the co-op, to give you a donation or to give you a long-term loan right? Doing something like that. Or, with Freedom Quilting Bee, they actually started by selling some quilts and then used that money to then start the co-op. So in some ways, kind of doing the thing you want the co-op to do before it's a co-op, to raise the money, and then use the money to start up. Having very small equity payments. So they often, even if it wasn't a worker co-op, which do use installments, but even consumer co-ops, Black consumers co-ops would allow you to pay in installments. So you could pay, $1 here, $5, $10 here until you made up your whole equity payment over time. I don't know how much in the audience knows about co-ops, but anyway, you're supposed to put in something. And so this was a way. So that notion of paying in installments, which the mainstream co-op community didn't have. And then, right, the different kinds of parties trying to get the other Black organizations that might not be doing co-ops, but to help donate space, time to the co-op, that kind of thing worked a lot. And then a lot of sweat equity, right? A lot of just people putting in time and energy and labor to make sure the co-op happens. So it's certainly, so that's again, I don't know, I think all my answers keep saying it's this and this, not this or this. So I think we do, right? We could make a lot more progress if we had the right public support and if we were allowed to use our own public money to do this kind of stuff. But even without it, I've seen all kinds of examples of how the co-ops have been able to thrive. And for the Blacks, sometimes it was better for them because often, again, if they got government money, there were strings tied. And if they didn't do, or if they were too political or this or that, they could get the money taken away. So often they found it much easier just to say, we're not going to take the money, even if it's available, and let's make sure we can raise it from among ourselves, either the products that we make or friends and neighbors, lots of fundraising kinds of things. Again, start small and try to build up from there. And then start your own credit unions, right? That was another thing. If everybody puts their money in a credit union, then you can get credit union loans. So that would be the other thing. Control your financial institution and then try to use that to do the co-op development.
Hi. Okay. Is that good, Edna? Would you like to? Just unmuting. I'm trying to unmute you. Right. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, that's very good insight. And yeah, we'll see how to, go around all these. Yeah.
So definitely.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah,
good luck. But I know you guys have some strong co-op financial institutions, right? I've seen
but it's
some stuff where you have connections.
It's free market. So really, you must have collateral, and then you see for women and marginalized groups, that becomes a bit of a challenge.
It's hard to get access. Yeah. No, I thought you had some co-op banks or something that were connected to co-op agriculture.
They are microfinance, but they operate in free market.
Still.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, you need more access to non-exploitative finance.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some good pointers there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Edna.
Thank you very much.
Again.
Yeah.
Okay, just going on to a few more questions. Speak to you later, Edna. So if you just put your mic and your camera off, then we can go into the next question. All right? Got that? Excellent. So there's a question here about, have you got the mic at the bottom or the camera?
Yeah, it's somehow my computer is hanging or something. So
okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to click and then, it's
I know. Don't worry, don't panic. It's not the end of the world.
Let
have you on stage. That's the three of us. So
everything's just hanging.
It's okay. It's okay. We'll see how it goes. But we've got another 10-15 minutes. So just saying about this next question, which is an interesting one as well, is should the change we're talking about be international, or should it have roots within individual countries? Very interesting question there.
Yeah, another great question. And I get that question not just about international, national, but like only Black or only Latinx or everybody in the US. And so I'm embarrassed to keep saying it's both, but anyway.
Getting used to this now.
I do think it's important. I think it's really important for solidarity to happen on a variety of levels. my biggest issue is because we live, our whole global system right now is a racialized capitalist system. That means that even when you try to not see race or not worry about race, it's still there. So I think the only way that we can address racism and race is with race. So I do think there needs to be solidarity first among different ethnic groups and different national groups, right? Start where people already have an affinity, feel safe, trust each other. That's also why, as I said, a lot of the Black co-ops started in a church or with a fraternal organization, because people already had solidarity. They already had relationships, social relationships. And so then having economic relationships wasn't so far-fetched. So I do think we need to start, because so much of cooperativism requires that sense of trust and solidarity. We have to make sure that people trust and feel solidarity with each other. So I think it's okay to start with nations doing it, with subgroups doing it, subpopulations doing it, even women-owned co-ops, Black-owned co-ops, to get people established, safe, understanding the model, practicing the model. But then there is a point where if we really want it to take off, if we want it to be a global movement, we're going to have to figure out how to connect those sort of segregated sectors, right? So how can Blacks and Latinx and whites work together in the United States, right? How can women and men's co-ops work together? And then how can US co-ops work with Canadian co-ops, work with UK co-ops, right? So again, to me, it's sort of stages, but I think it's harder to start from the large, right? So I guess that cliche, think globally, but act locally, right? It's really hard to act globally if you haven't acted locally first. But when you act locally, if you have a notion that we're trying to make this global, then the stuff you do locally, you'll always have an eye to connecting to other people who have the same idea, who are doing similar things. You'll start doing those interlocking value chains, supply chains, that kind of thing. But I think it's really hard to start from the top, from the big, if you haven't even solved all those issues, because then there's all these microaggressions, stereotypic views of each other, distrustful things that could break everything apart. So I want us to start where a place where the connections are strong and can be strengthened. And then from those positions of strength and connection, you can then make the group bigger and bigger and bigger in ways that make sense for everybody.
Yeah, it's a scaling up. You've got to get that core, as you say, strong and firm for it to then build to something more tangible and wider.
Right.
So Cassidy is asking, so I think we could get Cassidy up. Do you think that a lack of understanding can contribute to the problems because of them possibly not understanding through no fault of their own? So this is going back to your education question, I think. And Cassidy, would you like to come up? See if you, let me see if I can get you up. But it is very much about having the ability to, ignorance is something to always figure out. Here we go. I don't think she's got her camera connected, perhaps. So, okay, so just take the question. Sorry, Jessica.
Yes, and you're right. I would connect it to the education issue. That's why I'm so keen on let's start at preschool, right? Because I think if we don't beat cooperation out of children, but actually help them to understand its strengths and how to use it and how to be better cooperators, that then as they become young people, as they become adults, they can apply those and demand them, right, in their economics and the politics. So I think we do have to do education at every single level. Obviously, we have adults right now who need to be educated. So even if we educated all the young people, we doesn't absolve us from also dealing with adult education. Almost every single African-American cooperative that I found and talked about in my book, and I think I identified over 200 or 280 of them or something, they all started with some kind of study circle, study group. Partly they would come together just to study the economic conditions they were in, and then learned about co-ops and decided to be a co-op, and then studied co-ops so they could open a co-op store or start a co-op society or start a credit union. But that notion that they came together to talk and learn together, that also is another way to start to help with trust and solidarity, right? If you're all learning together and talking it out and that kind of thing. Some of the stronger co-ops had months to years of talking together first and learning together before they even opened their first enterprise or started their first business. And so that collective learning and what the International Cooperative Alliance calls continuous education, I don't think you can skimp on that. So that's one thing that I think we can think of that's really important. The other thing is practice, right? So it's not enough that we just sort of start teaching cooperative economics and solidarity. Really, we learn the best by doing, right? So that's the other thing. Yes, take the time to do the education, but start practicing some of this stuff, right? Even if you start practicing collective decision making even before you actually open the business or whatever. But right, because as we do it, we can get sort of the kinks out and we can figure out what's getting in people's way. So if we try to practice it even in our families, if we practice it in the study groups that we're in, if we start, right, some of the groups started buying clubs first before they even opened a real store. And that's starting to practice it, right? They pooled their money, buy in bulk, decided what to buy, how to distribute, right? All that is practicing democracy, practicing economic collaboration, right? And so I think we've got to, my co-op education for young people is that they should also start their own little co-ops. There are projects where you can have a credit union in a school garden. I have examples in my book about youth co-ops. One does lead abatement to get lead out of soil. So does landscaping with lead abatement. Another group had a school garden and made salad dressing and sold it. Another group made soap and sold that. So just getting kids to start their own co-ops, even getting adults to do small things together so they can see how it works. They can start to see what the problems might be, how they feel about it, right? So sort of low stakes practicing as you're learning, I think also makes a huge difference. And that's where, again, I get so upset that we have, so much of our lives are the opposite of that we don't get a chance to really practice how to treat each other like human beings and how to think and make decisions together. So any chance we get to do that, I think helps to move us closer to having a stronger solidarity and cooperative economy.
Makes a lot of sense. You can't run or walk until you can crawl and learn baby steps first. So we just had Poppy's question was pipped to the post by another one, which is, how do you embed economic democracy in the co-op when members are contributing or donating unequally? Is solidarity and common purpose enough in this regard, or are more formal voting and decision making, I think she means to say required, it's just missing. So yeah, the wealth thing. Yeah. You touched up on it in your speech earlier, but yes, please carry on.
So another hard question, but I'll do my best to answer it. What I've noticed in studying some of the co-ops, there's a couple things that co-ops have done to try to sort of equalize, right? There's always sort of more charismatic people. There's some people who are better at the work, whatever the work of the co-op is. There was a women's sewing co-op in North Carolina in the 80s. One of the things they did, because they realized their members, some of them sewed better than others. And they, so I don't know, I don't want to get into too much detail, but they were paid sort of by the piece. So if one person was really quick, right, maybe she finished 20 pieces in a day and somebody else only finished 10, but that meant the person who only finished 10 got paid a lot less than the person who finished 20, right? But they're both working the 8 hours or whatever. So they were trying to figure out, right, how do you equalize that and not let somebody feel, right? And so they came up with this formula, right? So everyone got paid a certain amount per piece. So instead of being paid by the hour, you were paid by what you finished. There was a base price, so there was wage solidarity in that sense. Everyone got the same price, right? But you did get a bonus for certain percentages over a certain amount a day. So they took sort of the lower average of what the day was to figure out, right? And then if you did a lot more, you did get, they had a whole weighting system so that you could get a little bit more. There was a group, there's a worker co-op that was a peep show for sex dancers. And the thing they did, they also had wage solidarity. Everybody got the same hourly wage, but you also make tips. And so what they did in a peep show, they have two types of rooms, an individual dancer or a window with 3 or 4 dancers. Well, the individual dancers get better tips. Well, in the co-op, they actually rotated equally who got to be in the single window. In the regular peep shows, they only let the very svelte blondes have the single window, right? So, right, but in the co-op, they shared. Everybody got their equal time at the window where they could make higher tips. They also rotated the manager position. So they had 2 managers, a day and a night manager, and every 3 to 6 months, they rotated who that was, and the manager got more money because it was a little bit more stressful of a job and a little bit more coordination. So everybody rotated through the manager job if they wanted it. So again, there's ways you can try to think about it's right. There's not always going to be equality in the work or the skill, but you can make if equality is your interest or equity, you can figure out how to make it fair and how to distribute it better. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues is you have to be deliberate about wanting to fix that issue, and you have to have your eyes open to see where the inequalities are, right? Because sometimes we're so used to inequalities, we don't recognize them, right? So even like with the piecework, right, you might not have recognized that the person who was a little bit slower, but maybe just as good, might have been losing out, right? But they started to recognize it and fixed it by, with their weight system. So I think that's the big thing, right? Keep your eyes open, listen, communicate well with people, try to figure out what's sort of the base wage solidarity, and then where are the discrepancies, and then how can you even them out as much as possible. But you have to be very deliberate. None of this stuff just happens because everybody cares. Right? You have to really be deliberate about these things. And I think that's the other thing people don't always think about.
But I think that's great observations that you're making, and also about creating parity is trying to solve those links that you see. But we are going to have one final question, and then we need to wrap up if that's okay. So Poppy, I'm really glad being able to get to this one because it's been there all the way, but you'll love this one. Jessica, she asks, I think your point could be easily understood with a thought experiment. What would racism look like? Would it exist, indeed, if African Americans were a community of rich people? No? Poppy, you can pop up just very quickly. We've got just a few minutes. If that's, do you want to pop up? Do you want to just put your camera and mic on, and we'll call this the last question. Okay. Sorry, folks, for any others that didn't get asked. I don't know if she's around. She may have popped off.
Maybe not.
There you go.
Anyway,
over to you.
Nice thought question. Yeah, believe me, a lot of us have thought about that a lot. So I think everybody being rich would go a long way, right? Because especially now, and being African American and being Black in this world is kind of associated with being lower class and poor, and so the stereotypes, right? However, it's not really that simple, because the stereotypes, the misunderstandings, the microaggressions still exist. In fact, some studies we have, rich Black people in the United States are discriminated against as much or more than poor Blacks because they're in places where they can be discriminated more, right? It's a weird kind of counterfactual, but at least in the US, poor Blacks are so marginalized, they don't even always come in that much, aside from being policed and all that, but they don't always come in that much contact with white people and that kind of thing. Whereas rich Blacks are usually tokenized, by themselves. There's only 1 or 2 of them. And so in some ways they're discriminated against even more, even though they've got all this money, and you would think the money would mitigate that. So it's a nice thought practice. And let me leave you with this. I think there's two issues to be raised there. One is, if we're really talking about solidarity, cooperative economies and changing the paradigm, then technically we want everyone to be prosperous, but no one to be rich or richer than anybody else. So it's not that we want everyone to be rich. We want everyone to be prosperous under economic democracy and economic justice. And so just getting people rich doesn't solve it. But then the other piece, as I was saying, is even if you have money, if we still have sort of capitalism and exploitation, one, it usually means you had to exploit someone else to get the money. And two, we haven't addressed the racism that is so interwoven into the fabric, right? Racism and capitalism and exploitation they all kind of grew up together over the centuries. And so you have to deal with them intersectionally. You can't really separate. You can't say if you do one, then you've solved everything else. You got to address all of them together as a multiplicity. And so that's what makes it more complicated.
Well, that's been really a comprehensive view of how you can make a difference and join the dots. And one of my questions was going to be about what does it take to make the idea of community part of economic thinking. And you've given us some excellent food for thought. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
It was lovely. We'll see you again. I'm sure Henry will get you back. Okay. So everybody else, you can stay and talk to each other, because this platform, this festival, is all about making those connections that you touched upon as well, and learning from each other. So please stay if you have time. If not, see you next time. So thanks and good night or good day wherever you are. Bye bye.